There is a question that quietly unsettles evolutionary science, not because it lacks answers, but because every answer seems incomplete. Why did humans lose their fur? Not gradually in a harmless way, not after tools, clothing, or shelter were firmly established, but while we were still exposed, vulnerable, and biologically unfinished. Fur is not decoration. In nature, it is survival. It insulates against cold nights. It shields skin from parasites and scratches. It reduces direct exposure to the sun. It softens the damage of a hostile world. And yet, at some point deep in prehistory, a lineage of early humans began to shed it. This decision, or pressure, or accident, runs against the logic seen almost everywhere else in the animal kingdom. Creatures do not usually abandon protection unless the cost of keeping it becomes greater than the danger of losing it. That is what makes the human case so difficult to ignore. Early humans were not apex predators. They lacked claws. Their teeth were modest. Their speed was limited. In a landscape filled with large carnivores, venomous insects, and relentless sunlight, a bare body should have been a disadvantage, perhaps even a fatal one. And yet, the process continued. Some researchers suggest that rising temperatures played a role. As forests receded and open landscapes expanded, heat became a constant threat. Fur, once a shield, may have turned into a liability. A body that could release heat more efficiently might survive longer in the sun. This idea points to sweating. Humans possess an unusually dense network of sweat glands, capable of cooling the body through evaporation. In theory, reduced body hair would enhance this effect, allowing heat to escape more rapidly during prolonged activity. But here, the theory begins to strain. Many animals live under the same sun. Many run, graze, hunt, and migrate across open terrain, and yet they keep their fur. Zebras, antelopes, lions, none of them chose the human solution. If heat alone were the driving force, the human body would not stand so isolated in its response. The problem deepens when timing is considered. Evidence suggests that significant hair loss occurred before humans had reliable clothing, before permanent shelters, before mastery over complex tools. This means there was a period, possibly a long one, when human skin was exposed without cultural protection. From a biological perspective, that is a dangerous window. Bare skin increases vulnerability to ultraviolet radiation. It raises the risk of dehydration. It exposes the body to insects and pathogens. Any advantage gained through cooling would have had to outweigh these risks immediately, or the lineage would not have survived. And yet, survival is exactly what happened. What makes this even more unsettling is what the archaeological record does not show. Hair does not fossilize. Skin almost never survives. There are no preserved remains that show the exact moment when fur thinned, retreated, or disappeared. Researchers are forced to reconstruct the story indirectly through genetics, physiology, parasites, and modern human variation. This absence creates space for uncertainty. It allows for the possibility that multiple human lineages once existed, each with different degrees of body hair, different adaptations, different outcomes. The nearly hairless body we inhabit today may not represent a single clear evolutionary strategy, but the outcome of selection after other versions failed. In that light, human nakedness stops looking like progress. It begins to resemble a gamble, a trade-off made under pressure, a solution that worked just barely, and one whose full cost may not yet be understood. And there is another complication that refuses to stay quiet. If early humans were losing fur under intense sunlight, then skin itself had to change, quickly. Many researchers argue that pigmentation and UV exposure are part of the story because unprotected skin is not merely uncomfortable, it can threaten fertility, immune function, and long-term survival. But pigmentation is not a switch that flips overnight. It evolves over time, across generations, and likely under shifting conditions. That suggests an awkward interval when bodies were becoming more exposed while defenses were still catching up. How long did that interval last? And what did humans do, day after day, during that vulnerable stretch? Some archaeologists point toward behaviors that rarely fossilize: shade-seeking routines, timing activity to avoid the harshest hours, early use of coverings made from plant fibers or hides that left almost no trace. Others consider a different possibility, that we are missing entire chapters. Populations that tried one path, failed, and vanished without leaving enough evidence to be recognized as a separate line at all. If heat and sweating were only part of the reason, then what unseen force made fur more dangerous than exposure? Because once you accept that question, a darker one follows. What exactly happened out there, on that sunlit ground, when a fragile human body began to go bare and the fossil record chose not to remember the moment? If losing fur offered an advantage, it was not a gentle one. Biology rarely removes a protective trait without exacting a price, and the human body paid that price in exposure. Once the fur thinned, the skin became the front line. Every hour in the open carried new risks: burning sunlight, biting insects, invisible pathogens, and injuries that fur once softened. Some researchers argue that this vulnerability forced a rapid reorganization of human biology. Skin pigmentation, for example, appears to have become increasingly important as hair diminished. Darker pigmentation can reduce the damage caused by ultraviolet radiation, protecting folate levels essential for reproduction. But here again, the timeline refuses to settle comfortably. Pigmentation evolves slowly. Hair loss appears to have occurred unevenly. The two processes may not have moved in perfect synchrony. That gap matters. During that interval, however brief or prolonged, it is difficult to explain how early humans avoided the biological consequences of constant UV exposure. Severe sun damage does not merely cause discomfort. It affects fertility, immunity, and survival itself. A population exposed too quickly would leave fewer descendants. Natural selection is unforgiving in this regard. And yet, humans persisted. This persistence suggests that biology alone may not carry the full explanation. Some archaeologists cautiously suggest that behavior began to compensate where anatomy fell short. Patterns of movement may have shifted. Activity may have been concentrated during cooler hours. Shade may have become a critical resource long before shelters were permanent. But these behaviors leave almost no trace. There are no fossils of routines, no stone tools labeled sun avoidance, no clear evidence of temporary coverings that could have protected skin without enduring in the archaeological record. This silence invites a more troubling possibility. If multiple human-like populations existed during this period, and genetic evidence suggests they did, then hair loss may not have been uniform across them. Some groups may have retained more body hair. Others may have lost it faster. Those differences could have influenced survival in ways that archaeology can no longer easily reconstruct. In this scenario, our nearly hairless form is not the inevitable outcome of evolution, but the surviving outcome. Other experiments may have ended quietly, leaving behind little more than fragmented DNA or ambiguous bones that resist classification. The mystery deepens when parasites are considered. Human lice provide an unusual clue. Genetic studies indicate that body lice diverged from head lice only after humans began wearing clothing. This implies that for a significant span of time, humans were largely naked, but already adapted to a life with reduced fur. That places hair loss firmly before reliable clothing, reinforcing the danger of that exposed phase. So why did the body not reverse course? Evolution can restore traits if conditions demand it. Fur could, in theory, return. But once hair density dropped and sweating became central to thermoregulation, regrowing thick fur may have become incompatible with the new system. Cooling, endurance, and prolonged activity in heat may have locked the body into a narrow path forward. At that point, nakedness was no longer optional. It had become structural. The human body, stripped of its ancestral insulation, now depended on a fragile balance: sweat for cooling, skin for signaling health, behavior for protection, and eventually culture to fill the gaps biology could no longer cover. What remains unclear is whether this balance emerged gradually, or whether it was forced by a sudden shift in environment, disease, or competition that left little room for alternatives. The archaeological record offers no clear verdict. Only bones, only gaps. Only a modern body that still carries the consequences of that ancient exposure. If losing fur reshaped human biology at its most vulnerable stage, then it may also have reshaped human behavior, social bonds, and dependence on shared knowledge long before language or civilization appeared. And that raises a final, unsettling question for this chapter. Was the loss of fur merely an adaptation to heat? Or was it the moment humans became dependent on something beyond their own bodies to survive? At some point after fur began to retreat, the human body adopted a strategy that appears at first glance almost reckless. It began to leak. Sweat, clear, salty, and constant, became the primary method by which humans controlled their internal temperature. Not through panting, like many mammals, not through thick fur that traps air, but through the deliberate loss of water across bare skin. This is not a minor adjustment. Humans possess millions of eccrine sweat glands distributed across nearly the entire body. No other primate comes close to this density. In fact, few mammals do. The system allows heat to escape efficiently through evaporation, especially during sustained movement under direct sunlight. Some researchers describe this as a defining human trait. But defining does not mean safe. Sweating comes at a cost. Every drop carries water and salt away from the body. Without reliable access to hydration, sweating becomes dangerous. Dehydration impairs judgment, weakens muscles, and can be fatal. A species that depends on sweating must either live near water or develop behaviors that ensure it can find it. This raises an immediate problem. Early humans did not control landscapes. They did not carry containers. They could not store water for long journeys. And yet, their bodies appear to have committed to a cooling strategy that assumes regular access to fluids. Why would evolution favor such a risky system? One possibility is endurance. A hairless, sweating body can remain active in heat long after furred animals must rest. As their body temperatures rise, many mammals are forced to stop. Humans, by contrast, can continue moving, slowly, steadily, relentlessly, while shedding heat through evaporation. This ability may have opened a narrow ecological niche. Not speed, but persistence. Not strength, but duration. Some anthropologists suggest that this allowed early humans to travel farther, forage longer, and possibly pursue prey until it overheated. In this view, sweating was not a side effect of hair loss. It was the payoff. But here again, the evidence resists closure. Endurance hunting, while documented in some modern contexts, is difficult to prove in deep prehistory. It requires specific terrain, social coordination, and an understanding of animal behavior. There is little direct archaeological evidence that it was widespread enough or early enough to drive a fundamental change in human biology. And even if it was, the danger remains. Sweating only works if the environment cooperates. High humidity reduces evaporation. Drought limits water. Injury or illness can turn fluid loss into a death sentence. A species that cools itself by sweating must live on the edge of balance between overheating and dehydration. This suggests that hair loss and sweating were not isolated adaptations. They likely emerged alongside changes in movement patterns, daily rhythms, and habitat use. Early humans may have begun to structure their lives around heat itself, when to move, when to rest, where to gather. But none of this fossilizes. Bones do not record thirst. Stone tools do not reveal sweating patterns. The archaeological record remains silent on how close early humans lived to failure. And then there is the matter of comparison. If sweating is such an effective solution, why did it not appear more widely? Why do other savanna-dwelling animals rely on different strategies? Why does this combination, hair loss plus intense sweating, appear almost uniquely human? The answer may lie not in what sweating provides, but in what it demands. Once the body commits to cooling through evaporation, it cannot easily return to insulation. Thick fur would trap sweat, reduce efficiency, and increase the risk of overheating. The system locks itself in. From that moment on, survival depends on behavior, cooperation, and foresight. Water must be found. Heat must be managed. The environment must be read correctly. A hairless, sweating body is not just a biological form. It is a contract with the landscape and with other humans. And if that contract was broken by climate shifts, droughts, or competition, then some populations may not have survived to pass their version of the body forward. Which raises a question that archaeology struggles to answer. How many human-like bodies failed under this system before one learned how to live with it? Once sweating became central to human survival, the body crossed a threshold that could not easily be reversed. A fur-covered animal can afford to rest through heat. A sweating animal must manage it. This distinction matters because evolution does not simply add new traits. It reorganizes priorities. In humans, thermoregulation shifted from passive insulation to active cooling. Heat was no longer something to endure. It became something to constantly negotiate. Some researchers argue that this shift fundamentally altered how early humans used their environment. Open landscapes that once posed a danger may have become navigable corridors. Long-distance movement under the sun, unthinkable for many animals, became possible, even advantageous. But advantage came with dependence. A body that cools through sweat is tied to water sources. Rivers, lakes, seasonal pools, these were no longer optional features of the landscape. They became lifelines. Groups that misjudged distance or timing would pay for it quickly. This dependency introduces a quiet archaeological mystery. If early humans clustered around water as a matter of survival, why do so many sites appear in arid regions? Why do some migration routes cross zones where water would have been scarce or unpredictable? Either early humans possessed a sophisticated understanding of seasonal resources, or some groups attempted these movements and failed. Failure leaves little behind. Bones weather away, temporary camps vanish. Entire populations can disappear without forming a clear layer in the archaeological record. This makes it difficult to know whether sweating and hair loss were universally successful or selectively disastrous. Genetic evidence hints at bottlenecks, periods when human populations shrank dramatically. While the causes remain debated, climate stress is often implicated. A body designed for heat management may perform poorly when conditions swing toward cold or instability. And yet, hair did not return. This is one of the most puzzling aspects of the story. Even as humans moved into cooler regions, even as ice ages advanced, the body remained largely hairless. Instead of regrowing fur, humans compensated culturally through fire, shelter, and eventually clothing. That choice suggests that by the time climate shifted, biology had already committed too deeply to reverse. Sweat glands, skin structure, and heat management were no longer compatible with dense fur. The cost of re-evolving insulation may have been too high. At that point, nakedness was no longer just an adaptation. It was a constraint. This constraint may help explain why human evolution appears increasingly entangled with culture. A furred animal can survive alone. A nearly hairless one cannot, not without knowledge, shared resources, and cooperation. Sweating bodies require planning. They require timing. They require collective memory. And this dependence may have filtered populations as strongly as any physical trait. Groups that coordinated water access, movement, and shelter would survive. Those that did not would fade. What remains unclear is how many times this filter operated. Were there multiple attempts at the human form? Multiple combinations of hair density, sweating capacity, and behavior? Multiple evolutionary drafts erased by heat, thirst, or cold? The bones do not answer. But the modern human body carries the imprint of a decision made long ago, one that traded insulation for endurance and independence for reliance on environment and culture. And as the next chapter will explore, once skin became exposed and sweat became constant, the sun itself entered the story, not as background, but as a force capable of reshaping human biology in ways we are still struggling to reconstruct. Because when fur disappears, the sky suddenly matters. When fur receded and sweat took over, the human body did not simply become lighter or cooler. It became visible to the sun. For most mammals, hair acts as a buffer between skin and sky. It scatters radiation, reduces direct exposure, and absorbs part of the daily assault of ultraviolet light. Remove that buffer, and the relationship changes immediately. The sun is no longer distant. It becomes intimate, constant, unavoidable. For early humans living in open landscapes, this exposure would have been relentless. Hours spent walking, foraging, or watching the horizon placed bare skin directly beneath intense solar radiation. Unlike cold or hunger, sunlight cannot be outrun. It is everywhere, every day. Some researchers suggest that this exposure created a new evolutionary pressure, one powerful enough to reshape human skin itself. Ultraviolet radiation is not merely a surface threat. It penetrates living tissue. It damages DNA. It interferes with folate, a nutrient essential for cell division and healthy reproduction. In populations exposed to high UV levels, reduced folate can lead to lower fertility and increased birth defects. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a population-level risk. If early humans lost fur without compensatory protection, their reproductive success would have been compromised. Over time, that pressure could shape pigmentation, favoring skin better able to absorb or block radiation depending on latitude and environment. This idea is widely discussed, but it introduces another problem. Skin color variation today is complex, gradual, and geographically patterned. That suggests a long process of adjustment, not a single rapid fix. Yet hair loss may have occurred earlier, placing exposed skin in danger before pigmentation had fully adapted. Once again, the timeline refuses to align neatly. How did early humans survive this mismatch? One possibility is that hair loss was not uniform. Some body regions may have remained more protected. Others may have lost fur first. The head notably retained dense hair, an anomaly that may not be accidental. Hair on the scalp could shield the brain from overheating and direct radiation while the rest of the body adapted more slowly. But this partial protection raises new questions. Why prioritize the head? Why not retain fur on shoulders, back, or neck, areas equally exposed? And why do other primates not show a similar pattern? Another explanation points toward behavior. If biology could not adapt fast enough, behavior may have filled the gap, seeking shade, altering daily activity cycles, avoiding midday exposure. These strategies are effective but invisible to archaeology. They leave no tools, no structures, no clear traces. We are left to infer them from absence. And absence is dangerous ground. Because the same absence allows for another possibility. that not all groups succeeded. Some populations may have lived under intense solar stress long enough to fail, producing fewer offspring, suffering higher mortality, and eventually disappearing. In that case, modern humans may descend only from those who occupied just the right balance of latitude, cloud cover, vegetation, and water, places where exposure was survivable long enough for skin to adapt. If true, this would mean that hair loss was not a universal success story, but a selective bottleneck. The sun would have acted as an unseen filter. Those who endured passed on their genes. Those who did not left little behind. And because skin does not fossilize, we cannot easily see the casualties. What we do see is a modern human population with a wide range of skin tones, all sharing the same basic condition: a largely hairless body still negotiating its relationship with the sky. Which leads to a deeper question. If sunlight helped shape who survived, how many human forms never made it past that exposure? Skin carries history, but it rarely preserves it. Unlike bone, it leaves no durable trace. It decomposes, erodes, and vanishes, taking with it the record of pigmentation, texture, and vulnerability that once mattered deeply to survival. This absence forces researchers to work backward, from living populations, from genetic signals, from indirect clues that resist precise dating. And in those clues, there is uncertainty. Genetic studies suggest that variations in skin pigmentation are relatively recent compared to the earliest stages of human evolution. This implies that for a long stretch of time, exposed skin existed without the full suite of protective adaptations seen today. During that interval, sunlight would have exerted relentless pressure. The consequences would not have been evenly distributed. Individuals with slightly more melanin may have fared better. Those with behaviors that reduced exposure may have survived longer. Entire groups occupying shaded or seasonally cloudy environments may have passed through the danger zone with fewer losses. Others may not have been so fortunate. This uneven survival complicates the story of human origins. It suggests that what we call early humans were not a single uniform population, but a mosaic of groups facing the same biological experiment under different conditions. Some archaeologists caution that this mosaic may include lineages we barely recognize. Fossil remains often defy neat classification. Bones appear human-like, but not fully modern. Features overlap. Boundaries blur. These remains are usually discussed in terms of brain size, posture, or tool use, but rarely in terms of skin or hair, because there is no direct evidence. Yet those missing traits may have mattered more than any stone tool. If certain groups retained more body hair longer, they may have been buffered against UV damage but disadvantaged in heat dissipation. Others may have lost hair rapidly, gaining endurance but suffering reproductive costs. Selection would not favor one universally. It would eliminate those that failed under specific conditions. Over time, this process could narrow diversity, not through a single catastrophic event, but through repeated, quiet losses. The archaeological record would reflect this only faintly. A site abandoned, a population thinning, a lineage fading without a clear boundary between success and extinction. This may help explain why modern humans share such a consistent body plan despite having evolved across varied environments. It is not necessarily because that plan was optimal everywhere, but because alternatives were filtered out. And once skin became the primary interface with the environment, it may have taken on roles beyond protection. Exposed skin can signal health, age, and condition. It can reflect hormonal changes. It can influence social perception. These effects are subtle, but in small populations, subtle differences can shape mating choices and social dynamics. Over generations, exposure may have intertwined biology with social selection in ways that leave no fossil signature. This intertwining deepens the mystery. Was hair loss driven solely by climate and physiology? Or did it also alter how humans saw one another? Who appeared healthy? Who appeared resilient? Who appeared suitable as a partner? If so, then the sun was not the only force shaping exposed skin. Other humans were watching. And as the next chapter will explore, once the body became visible in this way, hair loss may have intersected with movement, migration, and competition, placing human populations on paths that led far beyond their original landscapes. Because a body adapted to heat and exposure does not stay still for long. Heat and sunlight were not the only forces waiting for exposed skin. As humans moved through changing environments, sleeping on the ground, gathering in groups, returning to the same resting places, another pressure followed quietly, often unnoticed until it was too late. Parasites. Fur provides warmth, but it also provides shelter. It creates a protected microenvironment where insects can hide, reproduce, and feed without being easily removed. For many mammals, this is an unavoidable cost of insulation. Some researchers suggest that as early humans began living more socially, sleeping closer together, sharing spaces, caring for offspring, the burden of parasites increased. Fleas, ticks, mites, and lice thrive in dense populations. They spread disease, weaken the body, and reduce reproductive success. In this context, losing body hair may have offered an unexpected benefit. Less fur means fewer hiding places. Less fur means parasites are easier to detect and remove. Less fur means reduced transmission within groups. This hypothesis reframes hair loss not as a response to climate alone, but as a biological countermeasure to an ecological threat that intensified with social living. But the evidence remains indirect. Parasites themselves rarely fossilize. Their impact must be inferred through genetic traces and modern analogs. And here again, the pattern is suggestive, but incomplete. Human lice provide one of the few tangible clues. Genetic analysis indicates that head lice and body lice diverged after humans began wearing clothing. Body lice depend on garments, not hair, to survive. This implies that for a long period before clothing, humans were already largely hairless, yet still carrying parasites adapted to that condition. This timing complicates the story. If parasites drove hair loss, then hair loss must have occurred before clothing reduced exposure. But that would leave naked skin facing both insects and environment at once, a risky convergence of threats. And parasites are not evenly distributed. Some environments are dense with biting insects, others are relatively free of them. If hair loss was a response to parasitic pressure, it may have benefited some populations while harming others. Those in insect-heavy regions might gain an advantage. Those elsewhere might lose insulation without reducing disease risk. Such uneven outcomes again suggest selection rather than universal benefit. It is possible that early human populations experimented unknowingly, some retaining more hair, others less, while parasites, climate, and social structure determined which combinations endured. This interpretation aligns with a broader pattern in human evolution: repeated branching, testing, and pruning. Yet there is a problem. Many mammals live socially. Many face heavy parasite loads, and yet few abandon fur entirely. Grooming, behavior, and immune responses often suffice. Why then did humans go further? One possibility is that hair loss amplified the effectiveness of grooming and visual inspection. Exposed skin makes parasites easier to spot. It also makes illness visible. In small groups, this visibility could influence care, avoidance, or mating choices, subtly shaping survival. But this remains speculative. The archaeological record offers no clear verdict. What it offers instead is silence, broken only by genetic hints and biological oddities that refuse to resolve into a single explanation. As humans carried their nearly naked bodies across landscapes, parasites came with them. Some adapted, some disappeared. Some they have shaped biology in ways that tools never could. And this raises a troubling thought. If hair loss altered the relationship between humans and their parasites, did it also alter the relationship between humans and each other? If parasites helped shape the human body, their influence would not have been dramatic or sudden. It would have been persistent. An arms race measured not in generations, but in daily irritation, chronic illness, reduced fertility, and subtle shifts in survival odds. Parasites rarely kill outright. Instead, they weaken. They drain energy. They make bodies less resilient to heat, hunger, and infection. In small, mobile human groups, even minor disadvantages could accumulate. A child weakened by parasites grows more slowly. An adult burdened by disease travels less far. A pregnant woman exposed to infection risks complications that never leave skeletal traces. Over time, these pressures could filter populations quietly, without leaving clear signs in stone or bone. Hair loss, in this context, becomes part of a broader strategy, not a cure, but a mitigation. Exposed skin allows parasites to be seen and removed more easily. It reduces the stable habitats that fur provides. It may even alter body odor and microbial communities in ways that affect insect attraction. But mitigation is not the same as solution. Removing fur increases exposure to bites in the first place. It trades concealment for visibility. Whether this trade favored survival likely depended on environment, behavior, and social structure, variables that differed from group to group. This again suggests uneven outcomes. Some populations may have benefited from reduced parasite loads. Others may have suffered increased irritation, infection, or disease transmission. The result would not be a single evolutionary path, but many parallel attempts, some ending in continuity, others in disappearance. What complicates this further is immunity. As humans lost fur and parasites adapted, immune systems may have shifted as well. Skin became not just a barrier, but an active defensive organ, hosting microbes, triggering inflammation, signaling distress. These processes are difficult to detect archaeologically, yet they shape survival profoundly. Modern humans still bear the marks of this ancient negotiation. Skin conditions, allergic responses, sensitivity to bites, all hint at a body still fine-tuning its exposed interface with the world. And yet, parasites alone cannot explain everything. They do not account for the persistence of hairlessness across vastly different climates. They do not explain why fur did not return when parasite pressure lessened. They do not fully justify the risks of UV exposure and dehydration. At best, parasites are one pressure among many, which brings the focus back to a recurring theme: convergence. Heat, sweating, sunlight, parasites, social living, each exerts pressure in a different direction. None alone seems sufficient to strip a species of its fur, but together they form a narrow corridor where hairlessness becomes survivable, even advantageous, while alternatives are slowly eliminated. This corridor may have been easy to enter but difficult to leave. Once the body adjusted, once sweat glands proliferated, skin took on new roles, and behavior compensated for exposure, the cost of returning to a furred state may have exceeded the benefit. Evolution does not aim for comfort. It settles for viability. And viability often looks strange. The nearly naked human body viewed through this lens is not elegant. It is precarious. It depends on constant negotiation with environment, parasites, and other humans. It survives not by armor, but by balance. As populations moved, climates shifted, and competitors appeared, that balance would be tested repeatedly. Some groups passed the test. Others did not. And as the next chapter will examine, movement itself, migration across unfamiliar territories, may have amplified every risk introduced by hair loss, turning exposure from a local problem into a global one. Because once humans began to travel far from their origins, their nakedness traveled with them. Once humans began to move beyond familiar territories, hair loss stopped being a local adaptation. It became a traveling liability. Migration exposes bodies to unfamiliar conditions, new climates, new pathogens, new rhythms of temperature and light. For a furred animal, these transitions are buffered by insulation. For a nearly naked one, every change is felt directly on the skin. And yet, early humans moved anyway. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests repeated expansions into new regions, some hotter, some cooler, some more arid, others more forested. These movements did not occur after the body became fully protected by culture. They occurred while biology and behavior were still negotiating balance. This makes the persistence of hairlessness even more puzzling. If fur loss evolved under specific environmental pressures, migration should have favored its reversal in less suitable regions. But that did not happen. Instead, humans adapted around nakedness, modifying behavior, timing, and eventually, technology. This pattern suggests that by the time long-distance movement began, the human body had already crossed a point of no return. Sweating systems, skin structure, and heat tolerance had become so central to survival that regrowing dense fur may no longer have been compatible. A furred body would overheat during sustained travel. It would trap sweat. It would undermine the very endurance that allowed migration in the first place. Endurance, then, may be the hidden constant. A hairless body can walk long distances under the sun. It can track resources across wide ranges. It can exploit landscapes that reward persistence over speed. But endurance is only useful if the environment allows recovery. Migrating humans had to find water regularly. They had to rest in shade. They had to avoid exposure during the hottest hours. These constraints would have shaped routes, seasons, and group decisions, choices that leave little trace in the archaeological record. Where evidence does appear, it is fragmentary. Stone tools scattered across wide areas. Temporary camps without clear structures. Bones transported far from their place of origin. These traces tell us that movement happened, but not how dangerous it was. What we cannot see are the failures. Groups that misjudged distance. Populations that entered regions where heat, cold, or sunlight exceeded tolerance. Lineages that disappeared before leaving a genetic or cultural imprint. Migration, in this sense, acts as an amplifier. It magnifies every weakness introduced by hair loss. UV exposure intensifies near the equator. Cold nights become lethal at higher latitudes. Parasite communities change. Water becomes unpredictable. And yet, humans continued to expand. This persistence suggests that hair loss was not merely tolerated, it was integrated into a broader survival strategy. The naked body became the default, and the world had to be navigated accordingly. But navigation requires information, knowledge of landscapes, memory of seasonal changes, communication within groups. These demands may have pushed human evolution further toward cooperation and shared understanding, not as cultural luxuries, but as biological necessities imposed by exposure. Which raises a quiet but unsettling possibility. If hair loss forced humans to rely on movement, memory, and coordination, then the body we recognize as human may have been shaped as much by failed migrations as by successful ones. And the record of those failures, like fur itself, has largely disappeared. When migration becomes a filter, survival stops being evenly distributed. It favors those whose bodies, behaviors, and decisions align closely enough with the demands of unfamiliar land. For a nearly hairless species, that alignment would have been narrow. A small margin of error separated endurance from collapse. Cold nights are unforgiving to exposed skin. Dry landscapes punish bodies that lose water through sweat. Dense forests trap humidity, weakening evaporation. Each new region presented a different test, and not all human groups would have passed. This is where the archaeological silence grows heavier. Genetic studies reveal repeated population bottlenecks, periods when human numbers dropped sharply. The causes are debated: climate volatility, volcanic events, resource scarcity. But hairlessness would have amplified the impact of all of them. A body dependent on precise thermal balance is less resilient to sudden change. When conditions turned hostile, fur could not return in time. Evolution does not work at the pace of crisis. If a population encountered cold or instability that exceeded its tolerance, biology could not quickly compensate. Those groups would disappear, leaving behind little more than scattered artifacts or ambiguous bones. What survived was not necessarily the strongest form, but the most compatible one. Over time, this process may have sculpted a remarkably consistent human body plan, not because it was ideal everywhere, but because alternatives were repeatedly removed. Hairier variants may have struggled in heat and endurance. Less pigmented skin may have suffered under intense UV. Bodies less efficient at sweating may have failed during long-distance travel. The result is what we see today: a species unified by exposure. Modern humans differ in height, build, and skin tone, but nearly all share the same basic condition: a largely hairless body that relies on sweat, behavior, and culture to survive. This uniformity is striking given our global distribution. It suggests heavy filtering. Not a single evolutionary leap, but countless small eliminations. And once culture began to fill the gaps left by biology, fire for warmth, shade for protection, later clothing for insulation, the pressure to reverse hair loss diminished further. Cultural solutions are faster than genetic ones. They buffer the body against environments it was never fully designed to inhabit. But this buffering came at a cost: dependence. A furred animal can survive without tools. A naked human cannot. Strip away shelter, fire, and shared knowledge, and the exposed body is suddenly fragile again. This dependence hints that hair loss was not simply an adaptation, it was a commitment to a different mode of existence, one that ties survival to memory, cooperation, and invention. Which brings us to a final tension in this chapter. If the modern human body is the product of survival through migration, through repeated loss and selection, then what we call human nature may be built on absence, on the forms that did not endure, on bodies that were close but not close enough. Their fur, their bones, their failures, mostly gone. What remains is a species that learned to live without its oldest protection, and in doing so reshaped not only its body, but its future. And as the next chapter will explore, once hair was gone and movement became essential, humans crossed another threshold, one where biology alone was no longer sufficient to explain survival. Because eventually, naked skin demanded something new, not adaptation, but invention. A nearly hairless body cannot wait for evolution to solve its problems. It must improvise. Once humans moved into regions where nights were cold, winds were sharp, and seasons shifted unpredictably, exposure became more than discomfort. It became a threat that biology alone could not resolve fast enough. This is where fire enters the story, not as a triumph of ingenuity, but as a necessity forced by nakedness. Fire provides warmth. It deters predators. It extends activity into darkness. For a furred animal, fire is an advantage. For a hairless one, it is protection. Some researchers suggest that once fur was lost, the selective pressure to control fire intensified dramatically. A body without insulation cannot afford long exposure to cold, especially during sleep. Nighttime temperatures drop quickly, even in warm climates. Without fur, hypothermia becomes a real risk long before freezing conditions appear. This reframes the relationship between hair loss and technology. Rather than fire enabling hair loss may have made fire unavoidable. But the evidence here is frustratingly unclear. The archaeological record offers scattered signs of fire use: burned bones, charcoal fragments, heat-altered stones, but these traces are intermittent and difficult to interpret. Controlled fire may have been used irregularly for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years before it became reliable. That gap is unsettling. If humans were already largely hairless, and if fire was not yet consistently controlled, how did they endure cold nights, sudden weather shifts, or seasonal cooling? Temporary solutions, huddling, choosing sheltered locations, timing movement could help, but they are fragile defenses, and fragility implies loss. It is possible that many groups did not survive long enough to master fire consistently. Those that failed would leave behind little evidence, especially if their camps were temporary and their numbers small. Once again, survival may have been selective. Those who learned to maintain embers, protect flames from wind, and transport fire across landscapes gained more than warmth. They gained stability. A naked body near fire can survive environments that would otherwise be inaccessible. But this advantage creates dependence. Fire must be fed. It must be guarded. It must not be lost. A furred animal can walk away from cold. A hairless human cannot, not without consequence. Control of fire ties survival to vigilance, planning, and social coordination. Someone must stay awake. Someone must gather fuel. Someone must remember how to relight what is lost. These demands may have reshaped social structure. Groups that cooperated around fire would survive more reliably. Those that failed to do so would face repeated exposure, especially during illness, injury, or infancy, when naked bodies are most vulnerable. Infants, in particular, complicate the picture. Human babies are born remarkably helpless. Without fur, they lose heat rapidly. Fire and shared care become essential not only for adults, but for reproduction itself. This suggests that once hair loss reached a certain threshold, successful reproduction may have required technological and social support. That is a profound shift. It implies that human biology crossed into a zone where survival was no longer an individual matter. Nakedness forced reliance, not only on tools, but on other humans. And yet, fire leaves traces. We find them. What we do not find are the remains of those who failed before fire became dependable. Their absence may distort our understanding, making success appear smoother and more inevitable than it truly was. If hair loss pushed humans toward fire, and fire pushed humans toward cooperation, then naked skin may have been one of the earliest forces binding human lives together. Which leads to an unsettling thought. If fire had not been mastered, would a hairless human ever have endured long enough to become human at all? Once fire became reliable, something irreversible may have occurred. The human body stopped being self-sufficient. This was not an immediate transformation, but a gradual crossing of a threshold. With each generation that depended on warmth from flame rather than fur, the selective pressure to restore insulation weakened. Biology no longer had to solve the problem alone. Culture had entered the equation. But culture is fragile. Fire can be lost, fuel can run out, knowledge can fail to transfer. A furred animal survives these lapses. A naked one does not. This imbalance may explain why fire, once adopted, appears to become increasingly central to human life. Archaeological sites show repeated use of hearths in the same locations, suggesting not just warmth but planning, returning to places where fire could be maintained and protected. Fire anchored groups. It created fixed points in a mobile world. It turned camps into refuges. It reduced the cost of exposure temporarily. But dependence on fire also increased the consequences of disruption. Climate shifts, storms, or resource scarcity could extinguish flames and strand groups in conditions their bodies were no longer equipped to handle. This may help explain why human expansion appears episodic rather than continuous. Bursts of movement are followed by pauses. Advances are followed by retreats. A naked body supported by fire could push boundaries, but only so far. There is another complication. Fire does more than provide warmth. It changes diet. Cooked food is easier to digest, releasing more energy. Some researchers suggest that this dietary shift supported brain expansion. If so, hair loss, fire use, and cognitive development may be linked, not as a linear sequence, but as a feedback loop. Less fur increases dependence on fire. Fire enables cooking. Cooking supports larger brains. Larger brains improve fire control. This loop, if it existed, would further lock the human body into its exposed state. Once intelligence and technology begin compensating for biological vulnerability, evolution has little incentive to reverse course. But feedback loops are unforgiving. They reward success disproportionately and punish failure absolutely. Groups that mastered fire and cooperation could thrive despite nakedness. Groups that lost fire or failed to maintain it would face rapid decline. Their disappearance would leave little trace, especially if it occurred repeatedly over long spans of time. What survives is the illusion of continuity. The fossil record shows us the winners. It does not show us the many attempts that collapsed quietly. This matters because it reframes the human body not as a finished design, but as a compromise stabilized by behavior. Our lack of fur is not simply an adaptation to heat. It is a sign that biology handed part of the survival burden to culture and never took it back. Even today, this dependency remains. Remove shelter, remove clothing, remove shared knowledge. The exposed human body quickly reveals its limits. Which leads to a question that archaeology cannot answer directly, but biology continues to echo. Did humans lose their fur because fire made it safe to do so? Or did humans need fire because losing fur made survival otherwise impossible? And if the answer lies somewhere in between, then the next mystery becomes unavoidable. Once the body became dependent on tools and shared behavior, what else changed with it? Among all the changes that reshaped the human body, one detail refuses to conform. We lost fur almost everywhere, except on our heads. This is not a trivial exception. It is a biological anomaly. If hair was a liability in heat, why retain it where sunlight is strongest? If sweating required exposed skin, why preserve dense growth atop the skull? If hairlessness improved survival, why stop short at the scalp? Researchers have offered cautious explanations. Hair on the head may shield the brain from direct solar radiation. It may reduce heat gain while allowing sweat on the face and neck to evaporate. In this sense, scalp hair could function as a localized compromise, protection without complete insulation. But this explanation is incomplete. Other mammals face the same problem. Many have large brains. Many live under intense sun. Yet they do not display this precise pattern, a mostly bare body crowned with concentrated hair. The human solution is oddly specific. This specificity suggests that once fur loss began, selection did not act uniformly. Different body regions faced different pressures. Skin that aided cooling on the torso may have been dangerous on the skull. Evolution, working without foresight, may have preserved hair where exposure was most costly. But there is another layer to consider. Hair is not only physical protection, it is visible. It moves. It changes with age, health, and hormones. In social species, such features rarely remain neutral. Exposed skin reveals condition. Hair frames the face. Together they broadcast information. Some anthropologists cautiously suggest that once the human body became mostly naked, remaining hair took on added significance. The scalp, always visible in upright posture, became a focal point. Subtle differences, thickness, texture, pattern, may have influenced perception long before language or formal symbols existed. This introduces the possibility that sexual selection played a role, not as a primary cause of hair loss, but as a force that shaped what remained. If exposed skin made health easier to assess, and scalp hair enhanced recognition or attractiveness, then hair distribution could shift in response to social preference, as well as environment. But preference is dangerous territory. It does not fossilize. It does not leave tools. It leaves only outcomes. What we observe today, a nearly hairless body with a persistently hairy head, may be the residue of countless choices made in small groups, repeated over generations, guided by instincts we can no longer reconstruct. And this complicates the story further. If hair distribution was influenced even partly by social perception, then hair loss was not driven by environment alone. It intersected with how humans evaluated one another, who appeared healthy, who appeared capable, who appeared desirable. This does not mean conscious choice. It means cumulative bias. Tiny advantages repeated often enough can reshape a species. Yet even this explanation leaves gaps. Why did eyebrows remain? Why eyelashes? Why sparse hair in specific regions? Each remnant hints at a function: protection, signaling, filtration, but together they form a patchwork rather than a clean design. This is what evolution often looks like when pressured to adapt quickly. Not elegance, but survival stitched together from partial solutions. The human body, seen this way, is not optimized. It is negotiated. And the head, crowned with hair, stands as evidence that fur loss was not an all-or-nothing event. It was selective, uneven, and influenced by forces that extended beyond temperature and sunlight. Which leads to an uncomfortable thought. If some hair remained because it mattered socially, then the loss of the rest may have changed how humans judged one another long before written history began. And that means nakedness did more than expose skin. It exposed the human body to human eyes. Once most of the human body became exposed, vision took on a new role. Skin reveals information. It shows injury, illness, age, and fatigue. It responds to emotion, flushing, paling, sweating. In a furred species, much of this is concealed. In a naked one, it becomes unavoidable. Some researchers suggest that this visibility altered social dynamics in early human groups. Health could be assessed at a glance. Wounds could not be hidden. Physical condition was no longer private. It was communal knowledge. This transparency may have had survival value. In small groups, recognizing sickness early could reduce contagion. Noticing weakness could trigger care or avoidance. Over time, individuals who could read these signals accurately would make better decisions about cooperation and risk. But transparency also invites judgment. Exposed skin allows comparison. Comparison enables preference. Preference shapes reproduction. If certain skin conditions, pigmentation patterns, or hair distributions correlated with health or resilience in specific environments, they could influence mate choice without conscious intent. Over generations, such preferences could amplify biological trends already underway. This possibility does not imply intention or aesthetics in a modern sense. It implies feedback. Biology changes visibility. Visibility shapes interaction. Interaction shapes reproduction. The result is a loop that operates quietly without leaving physical evidence, which makes it difficult to separate cause from consequence. Did hair loss expose skin because it was advantageous? Or did exposed skin become advantageous because hair was already gone? The direction matters, but may be impossible to determine. What can be said with more confidence is that nakedness likely intensified the importance of social cohesion. In a body without fur, injury and cold are greater threats. Cooperation becomes more valuable. Care for the sick, sharing warmth, guarding fire, these behaviors reduce the risks of exposure. Groups that practiced them would survive more reliably. Those that did not would fade. Again, survival filters quietly. The archaeological record shows increasing signs of social behavior, shared spaces, repeated use of sites, evidence of care for injured individuals. While these behaviors have many causes, nakedness may have raised the stakes. A furred animal can survive alone for longer. A naked human struggles. This dependence may have selected for traits that reinforced group living, tolerance, communication, memory, and emotional bonds. Over time, these traits become inseparable from the body that required them. In this sense, hair loss may have contributed not only to physical vulnerability, but to social complexity. The exposed body demanded protection. Protection demanded cooperation. Cooperation reshaped humanity. Yet there is still a gap. If nakedness fostered social bonds, why did it not spread to other species? Many animals live socially. Many benefit from cooperation, and yet none followed the same path of exposure. The difference may lie in timing. Hair loss occurred while humans were already becoming mobile, tool-using, and cognitively flexible. In that context, exposure could be buffered by behavior. In species without those capacities, the same change would be fatal. This suggests that hair loss did not create humanity alone, but it locked humanity into a trajectory where culture and biology became inseparable. Once skin was visible, everything else followed. Health, trust, attraction, care, and perhaps in time, something more abstract. Identity. As the next chapter will explore, once the body became naked and socially readable, humans may have begun to mark themselves in new ways, ways that substituted culture for fur and symbol for biology. Because when the body loses its natural covering, something else eventually takes its place. A naked body does not remain naked for long. Once fur was gone and skin became the primary interface with the world, humans began to alter that surface, not biologically, but symbolically. This was not an immediate shift, nor a conscious one. It emerged slowly, unevenly, and in ways that archaeology can only glimpse. Marks on the body begin to appear in the record long before writing, agriculture, or cities. Pigments, scratches, scars that were not accidental. These traces suggest that exposed skin invited modification. When the body no longer carried its identity in fur patterns or seasonal coats, humans may have begun to project meaning directly onto skin itself. Some archaeologists argue that ochre use, one of the earliest widespread symbolic materials, was not merely decorative. Applied to skin, it could provide limited protection against insects or sunlight. It could also signal group membership, status, or ritual role. If so, this would mark a critical transition. Fur once served many purposes at once: protection, camouflage, recognition. When it vanished, those functions did not disappear. They migrated from biology to behavior. Skin became a canvas, but this canvas came with risks. Marking the body requires time, resources, and shared understanding. It assumes social stability. A solitary animal does not paint itself, a group does. This suggests that nakedness may have intensified the need for visible affiliation. In exposed bodies, belonging becomes a form of protection. Symbols communicate who is trusted, who is familiar, who shares resources and warmth. Again, the fossil record is quiet. Pigments degrade, skin vanishes, meanings dissolve. What remains are hints: ochre-stained tools, ground minerals, repeated patterns that suggest intent rather than accident. They imply that humans were compensating for biological exposure with cultural signals, and this compensation may have extended beyond appearance. Clothing, when it appears, does not emerge as a simple substitute for fur. Early coverings were likely partial, temporary, and situational, used for cold nights, ritual moments, or specific tasks. They did not restore insulation uniformly across the body. This selective coverage mirrors hair loss itself. Certain areas mattered more. Certain moments required protection. Nothing was absolute. Which raises a question. If culture replaced fur, did it do so completely or only just enough to survive? The answer may lie in how slowly clothing technologies spread. For long periods, humans endured with minimal coverings despite access to animal hides and plant fibers. This suggests that nakedness had already become tolerable, managed through fire, movement, and social coordination. Clothing was not a rescue. It was an enhancement. By the time it became widespread, the body had long since adapted to life without fur. Skin, sweat, and social behavior formed the foundation. Culture layered itself on top, not to undo exposure, but to refine control over it. This layering deepens the mystery. If humans could survive naked long enough to invent substitutes, then hair loss was not simply a mistake corrected by culture. It was a condition that shaped culture's earliest forms. And once symbols, pigments, and coverings began to carry meaning, the human body was no longer just biological. It became expressive, which suggests that the loss of fur may have opened a door not only to vulnerability, but to abstraction. As the next part will explore, this shift may have altered how humans understood themselves, not as animals among others, but as beings who could redefine their own boundaries. Because when protection is no longer grown, it must be imagined. When fur disappeared, the edge of the human body changed. For most animals, that boundary is fixed. Fur defines where the body ends and the world begins. It softens contact, it blurs outlines, it creates distance between skin and environment. For humans, that distance collapsed. Skin became the boundary, and boundaries invite control. Once the body was exposed, humans gained a new awareness of where they ended and the world began. Cold, heat, pain, and touch were felt more directly. This sensitivity may have sharpened perception, but it also demanded response. The naked body could not ignore its surroundings. In this state, altering the body, through marks, coverings, or adornments, was not simply aesthetic. It was a way of redefining boundaries that biology no longer maintained on its own. A layer of pigment could signal protection. A strip of hide could create warmth where none existed. A scar could carry meaning beyond injury. These were not replacements for fur. They were negotiations. Negotiations with climate, with other humans, with identity itself. Some anthropologists suggest that once humans began modifying their bodies intentionally, a subtle shift occurred. The body was no longer accepted as finished. It became something that could be altered, improved, or symbolically extended. This idea has unsettling implications. If the body is unfinished, then survival depends not just on genes, but on knowledge. Techniques must be learned. Meanings must be shared. Children must be taught not only how to live, but how to manage their own exposure. In a furred species, much of this is automatic. In a naked one, it must be remembered. This requirement may explain why early human cultures appear so persistent despite fragile technology. Knowledge, when to seek shade, how to tend fire, how to mark the body, became as important as physical strength. Those who forgot paid the cost quickly. Yet here again, archaeology struggles. Knowledge leaves no fossils. Mistakes leave no monuments. Only survival accumulates. Which means that what we see today is the residue of successful strategies, not the full range of attempts. and that selective residue may hide a deeper truth. If fur loss pushed humans to redefine their bodies culturally, then nakedness was not just a biological change, it was a conceptual one. It altered how humans related to themselves. The body became something to manage, something to protect intentionally, something to signify belonging. In this sense, hair loss may have accelerated a separation that defines humanity to this day, the separation between what we are born with and what we make ourselves into. Other animals adapt through anatomy. Humans adapt through intervention. That intervention began at the skin, which raises a question that lingers beneath the evidence. Did humans lose their fur because they were becoming cultural beings? Or did they become cultural beings because they lost their fur? The answer may never be clear, but what is clear is that once the body crossed this threshold, there was no return. Fur could not simply grow back and restore an older way of life. Too much now depended on memory, cooperation, and symbol. The naked body had rewritten the rules. And as the next chapter will examine, this rewriting did not stop at identity or culture. It extended into biology itself, into how humans spread, mixed, and replaced other forms of humanity. Because when a species depends on culture to survive, its evolution no longer follows a single path. By the time modern humans appear clearly in the record, something has already happened. The diversity is gone. Earlier phases of human evolution show variation, different body proportions, different skull shapes, different adaptations emerging in different regions. But as time progresses, that variety narrows. One form spreads, others fade. This pattern has long puzzled researchers. Human evolution does not look like a smooth ascent. It looks interrupted, fragmented, marked by branches that do not lead anywhere obvious. Some of those branches are known by name. Others exist only as ambiguous fossils that resist classification. What is rarely discussed is how hair, or the loss of it, may have contributed to this narrowing. Because hair does not fossilize, differences in body covering between populations are invisible to archaeology. Two skeletons may appear similar while representing bodies that interacted with the environment in fundamentally different ways. One may have retained more body hair, another may have been nearly naked. Those differences would matter enormously. A hairier body might tolerate cold better but overheat during sustained activity. A more exposed body might travel farther but suffer under UV or dehydration. Each form would excel under certain conditions and fail under others. Over time, shifting climates would favor one version, then another. But survival is not awarded evenly. When environments change rapidly, selection becomes ruthless. Marginal differences turn lethal. Populations adapted to narrow conditions collapse first. Others expand into the vacuum left behind. If hair loss locked some human groups into dependence on heat management, water access, and cultural buffering, then those groups would be especially vulnerable to disruption. But they would also, when conditions allowed, move faster and farther than their furred counterparts. Mobility becomes power. A group that can endure long distances under the sun can occupy territories before others arrive. They can exploit scattered resources. They can outlast competitors not by strength, but by persistence. This may have created asymmetry between human populations. Those with exposed bodies and endurance-oriented physiology could expand aggressively during favorable periods. Those with more insulated bodies might hold ground locally but struggle to match expansion. When these groups met, the outcome would not necessarily be violent. Replacement can occur through competition alone, through access to water, food, and mating opportunities. And once again, the record would remain silent. No fur to preserve, no clear markers of displacement, only a gradual disappearance. This possibility casts a different light on later encounters between human forms. When anatomically modern humans encountered other hominins, their success may not have depended solely on tools or intelligence. Their bodies, shaped by hair loss, sweating, and endurance, may have played an equally important role. If so, nakedness was not just adaptive, it was competitive. But competition sharpens consequences. Traits that offer advantage in one context become liabilities in another. Groups that expanded quickly could also collapse quickly if conditions shifted. This creates a cycle of rise and loss that archaeology struggles to capture, which leads to a troubling thought. How many versions of humanity existed, not in skull shape or brain size, but in skin, sweat, and hair, and vanished without recognition? Because if those differences never fossilized, then entire evolutionary experiments may have passed unnoticed, and what we call human today may be less a representative form than the last surviving draft. Evolution leaves behind the winners. It does not preserve the near misses. This bias shapes how we understand our own origins. We study the bodies that endured and assume they represent the natural endpoint of progress. But in reality, they may simply be the forms that happened to align with a narrow window of survival. Hair loss, in this light, looks less like a breakthrough and more like a constraint that some groups managed better than others. Those who balanced exposure with behavior, water access, fire control, social coordination, persisted. Those who failed, vanished. Their bones, scattered and incomplete, tell us little about the skin they once carried or the heat they once endured. This makes the human story appear deceptively clean. Genetic data shows bottlenecks, migrations, and replacements, but it cannot easily reveal the physical vulnerabilities that shaped those events. It tells us who survived, not why others did not. And because hair does not fossilize, we lack a crucial dimension of comparison. Two populations could share similar tools, similar brain sizes, and similar anatomy, yet differ radically in how their bodies handled heat, sunlight, and parasites. Those differences could determine expansion or extinction, and yet leave no obvious trace. This possibility unsettles traditional narratives. It suggests that human success was not driven by a single superior trait, but by a precarious alignment of many, some biological, some behavioral, some environmental. Hair loss may have tipped that balance in unpredictable ways. When conditions favored endurance and mobility, exposed bodies could spread rapidly. When conditions turned harsh or unstable, those same bodies could become liabilities. This dynamic would favor adaptability over specialization. Not the best body for one environment, but the body most easily supported by culture across many. That body is what we see today. Modern humans are not optimized for heat or cold. We are not furred enough for insulation. We are not bare enough to ignore exposure. We survive in extremes only with tools, clothing, shelter, and shared knowledge. This dependence may be the final legacy of hair loss. By shedding fur, humans shed self-sufficiency. They became creatures that require memory, cooperation, and invention to endure. In doing so, they outcompeted forms that relied more heavily on anatomy alone, but at the cost of fragility. Strip away culture, and the advantage disappears. Which brings us to the final chapter. If losing fur bound human survival to behavior and knowledge, then the exposed body is not just a relic of the past. It is an ongoing condition, one that still shapes how we live, migrate, and adapt today. And perhaps it carries a warning. Because when a species replaces biology with culture as its primary defense, it inherits all the risks of forgetting. Once fur was gone, it never returned. That fact alone deserves attention. Across hundreds of thousands of years, humans entered colder regions, higher latitudes, and harsher seasonal cycles. Ice advanced, glaciers spread, nights grew longer and colder. And yet, The human body did not respond by regrowing its ancestral insulation. Instead, it doubled down on exposure. This is not how most species respond to environmental stress. When conditions worsen, anatomy usually retreats toward safety: thicker coats, seasonal fur, physiological buffering. Humans chose a different path, or perhaps by the time conditions changed, no other path remained. The hairless body had become entrenched. Sweat glands, skin structure, and heat regulation were now foundational. Regrowing dense fur would have interfered with cooling, endurance, and the delicate balance that allowed long-distance movement. Biology had painted itself into a corner, so culture stepped in. Again. Fire grew more reliable. Shelters improved. Clothing became systematic. These were not optional upgrades. They were compensations for a body that could no longer adapt on its own. This substitution had consequences. Clothing does not evolve genetically. Shelter does not pass through DNA. Knowledge must be learned anew by every generation. This means human survival became conditional, not on anatomy alone, but on continuity. A furred animal can survive isolation. A naked human struggles. The exposed body demands inheritance of skill, memory, and cooperation. When those chains break, through disaster, displacement, or loss of knowledge, the body is suddenly revealed as incomplete. Even today, this remains true. Humans without shelter suffer quickly in cold. Humans without water succumb rapidly in heat. Humans without shared systems collapse under conditions other species endure routinely. This fragility is not a flaw. It is the price of a trade. By abandoning fur, humans freed themselves from certain biological limits. They could move farther, persist longer, and adapt behaviorally rather than anatomically. But they also accepted permanent dependence. The body stopped being the final line of defense. And once that happened, evolution itself changed character. Selection no longer acted only on genes. It acted on traditions, on cooperation, on the ability to remember and transmit solutions. In this sense, hair loss marks a quiet turning point. Not the moment humans became smarter, but the moment survival stopped being purely biological. The human body we inhabit today is therefore not simply an evolved form. It is a negotiated one, balanced between exposure and invention, vulnerability and memory. And that balance has never fully stabilized. As climates shift again, as environments change faster than culture can adapt, the ancient trade-off resurfaces. The same nakedness that once enabled expansion now ties survival to systems that can fail, which leads to a final, unsettling reflection. If fur was lost because culture could replace it, what happens when culture can no longer keep up? The loss of fur was never resolved. It was managed. From the moment humans shed their ancestral covering, every generation has lived with the same underlying condition: a body that is exposed by default and protected only by what it can remember, build, and maintain. This condition did not end in prehistory. It did not end with clothing. It did not end with cities. It persists. Modern humans often forget how unusual their bodies are. We compare ourselves only to one another, not to the rest of the animal world. But strip away infrastructure, heat, shelter, stored water, medical care, and the limits of nakedness reassert themselves quickly. Cold still kills. Heat still overwhelms. Sunlight still damages. The same pressures that once shaped hair loss continue to operate. They are simply buffered, temporarily, by culture. This buffering creates an illusion of mastery, because culture feels stable, technology feels permanent, knowledge feels secure. But none of these are guaranteed. Archaeology reminds us that complex systems collapse, skills are forgotten, populations fragment. When that happens, survival reverts to the body, and the human body is no longer self-contained. In that sense, hair loss was not just an adaptation. It was a wager that behavior would always compensate for biology, that memory would always outpace climate, that cooperation would always outlast disruption. So far, the wager is held, but it has held unevenly. Throughout history, exposure has returned whenever systems failed, during migrations, famines, conflicts, and disasters. Nakedness once again becomes visible not as absence of clothing, but as dependence revealed. And this returns us to the original question. Why did humans lose their fur? Not simply because heat demanded it, not only because sweating made it possible, not entirely because parasites, sunlight, or endurance favored it, but because a narrow convergence of pressures pushed the human body into a state where biology alone was no longer enough, and culture stepped in before extinction followed. Other versions may not have been so fortunate. Hairier humans may have overheated and stalled. More exposed humans may have burned, dehydrated, or failed to reproduce. Entire lineages may have existed only briefly, erased before they could stabilize the balance. What remains is not proof of inevitability. It is proof of survival. The human body today carries the memory of that ancient trade-off in every bead of sweat, every sensitivity to cold, every need for shelter. We are not naked because it is ideal. We are naked because it worked just well enough. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. The loss of fur did not make humans superior. It made them dependent. Dependent on fire, on water, on knowledge, on one another. Which means the story of hair loss is not a closed chapter in evolution. It is an ongoing condition. And as long as humans remain exposed beneath the sky, the question is not why we lost our fur, but whether the fragile balance that replaced it can always be maintained.